how often do you ever just put something out there just to see if the tools work rather than if the content is meaningful?
Fairly often.
Yeah,
Um,
I thought so.
fairly often. Um,
I mean, it's fun for you, right?
yeah, I mean, Twitter is entertainment. I mean, as much as information. So, but the way I would frame it is to say it's A/B testing. So, I mean, it's basically just another word for what you said. But I do put things out and say, I have a theory about this one that I think this one will go big. And I'll
We're
put it
talking
out.
about technique or we're talking about content?
Well, they're inseparable because
Okay,
your content is part of the technique,
okay.
right? Uh, but if I put something out there that's got all kinds of technique, I do watch it to see if I was right. And so, for example, uh, a typical viral tweet would be something that's in the news that day, something that people are really talking about. So there's something about it that makes people talk, and then you make a clever connection or a joke, sometimes connecting it to something else they're talking about. Like if you could tie, impeachment to the State of the Union in a clever way or anything, people just recognize that as humor and they laugh. So
Mhm,
when I put those kinds out, they're very formulaic. And those are the ones I watch the most because
mhm.
I'm seeing if the formula still works.
Interesting, and it does, and it still works?
It's very consistent.
Very
Yeah.
consistent.
And by the way, we mentioned Jack Posobiec.
Yeah.
I don't know if he thinks of it this way, but he has so much technique in his tweets. It's not a coincidence that they do well.
Yeah. Well, I'm saying Jack has been on fire, and I've watched him go from some sort of five-figure number of followers, just transitioning away from doing nothing but Game of Thrones tweets, into becoming a powerhouse in the media universe and a White House favorite, and to the and drawing the ire of every every other political journalist in America. They can't stand that guy. And
I think it's better because he always looks like he's enjoying himself.
well, he is. He is. He's having the best time of his life. I can imagine he's living such a good life, and I'm proud of him and really happy to see that. Um, was there a formula or something that did work for you before that has died? And is there like a if if you come to market with a product and everybody comes to market with the same product and it kind of dilutes the value, has there been a technique that worked that has been extinguished because it just been trampled by other people? Or
Well, there's some things that get overused. The one that I'm watching now is, and I've used it a number of times because it's always funny, narrator voice. If you
yeah,
do a tweet and you just say narrator colon, whatever you say after narrator is almost always going to be funny.
well,
It's one of those formulas that almost always works.
yeah. How I've been I've been trying to get funnier, Scott. And it's not really working for me. I've even read books on how to be funny. And it's interesting because there are formulas, there is a technique to it, and there are structures that work time and time and time again. And one of them is using a character, right? If you present a character saying something, and that character has one or two characteristics, and they just whatever they say or do matches with those characteristics, people tend to think that that's really funny. It's just like a program that hits in people's brains. Do you have formal training in humor writing? Is that something you've studied, or have you evolved through A and B testing, or how did you get to that point, you think?
So in my early days, it was just trial and error. But I've developed a formula. I think I'm going to sneeze in a minute, so just warning you. Um,
I'll get Rosie
so,
to bark right then.
sure enough. Um,
Bless you.
so I've you could Google this to see the details, but I wrote what I call the 6 dimensions of humor, and
Hmm.
the idea is that you have to use at least 2 of the 6 dimensions, or people will not even recognize it as humor.
Mm.
Now, I always falter when I'm trying to mention the 6. Well, I'll mention as many as I can remember off the top of my head. So, clever, bizarre, naughty. Um, I'll think of the others, but the point is, recognizable is another one. So, recognizable is probably the one you were talking about. So recognizable is if I take Dilbert and I put him in a situation which other people have been in, and they say, "Oh, my boss does that to me all the time." I have one dimension. But then I've got to do something clever or naughty. So in other words, the punchline is something, something hurt him in his butt, or there was, some vague, sexual problem that's not specified because it's a comic, but there's something there. Or it's a clever, almost engineering solution in the way they shouldn't have normally worked, but does. So if you put together 2 out of 3, you've got something. The best cartoonists in the world would start with 2. So if you look at Calvin and Hobbes, 2 of the dimensions are cute and bizarre. Calvin and Hobbes had a cute little kid and a tiger, but the tiger was sometimes a tiger and sometimes, stuffed. So that was bizarre. Plus there was a kid who sometimes talked like an adult. That was bizarre. So Watterson would start with 2 dimensions before he even wrote a joke. So it's not a coincidence that he had the most, probably the best, most people would say, comic of all time. And the Far Side had the same advantage.
People, I did a little tweets that I'm going to talk to Scott. Any questions for him? And one of the questions that came up the most was, have you ever met Watterson?
No, he's famous as a recluse, and neither of us have ever made an attempt to meet the other.
Got it. I have this thing, my kids, they tell me, oh, I send memes back and forth. We have this whole collection of memes. All we do all day is send each other memes. Now I understand memes to be an idea, but it seems to me memes is being changed for the word comic now. They're like one panel comics. Is there a relationship there, or am I missing that?
Well, the memes usually have a message.
Yeah.
Whereas comics sometimes are just trying to be funny. I think the meme usually has a utility or a function. So you're trying to mock somebody you don't like, to reduce their power. So there's always something you're trying to accomplish with a meme, that a comic is just entertainment.
Interesting. Are the most interesting and entertaining comics ones that do have a message in them, though, like something, or no?
Well, it depends. In Dilbert comics, the message that's sort of embedded in a lot of it is that management is silly and people are irrational, and we do things for the wrong reasons. We don't know why we're doing it. But that's not so much a social message.
Yeah.
If you tried to be too preachy in a comic, I don't think it would work.
So you bring it, subtext is really important in humor, right? It's the message that gets transmitted that's not overt in the messaging. Do you think about subtext when you're crafting your tweets and such, or do you just sort of, you have I imagine you're just so experienced now that you can just fire them off and the subtext comes out on its own? Or do you have a system or a process for that? Do you ever think subtext first and then how do I express that? Or
I've done it in every direction, but the most common direction, that's 95% of the time, I would say, is that I start with a situation. So something happens. Usually it's something in the real world that could happen to somebody. So I get one dimension. So I want to nail the first dimension, is like, oh yeah, that happened to me. Then the second dimension could be anything. Right. And if I could add a third dimension, then it's going to be a home run. So it's usually I just build it up from situation, what layer is automatic, and then what layer can I add to it.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me how there is an actual system to being funny. You go to watch a comedian do stand-up, and because the good ones are so good at it, it feels like, also when you're reading a book, it feels like they're just sitting there talking to you, they're just riffing. But really it's such an asymmetric experience, right? I read your book, and frankly, I find your writing to just be so accessible and so clear. It's fantastic. And it's not caught up in trying to sound fancy or anything, which in and of itself is a fanciness that most people can't grasp. Clarity is very difficult. But it's such an asymmetric experience. Your book was written in a draft and an outline, and then a draft, and then a draft, another draft, and it was edited and revised, and da. And for every paragraph, there's 50 paragraphs that went before it. But when you're reading it, it's like just an instantaneous flow. Have you ever reflected upon that? And is there any sort of relevance in sort of the way I don't really know where I'm going with this, other just to make this observation, is that the best sort of writing and communication seems simple and clear, but yet there's like an army of work that went behind it. It's a
Yeah.
very interesting relationship between creator and consumer, very asymmetric in its the effort that you have to put in.
So one of the reasons that I added persuasion to my talent stack is that as a writer, it makes all of your writing more accessible.
Yeah,
So learning to write simple, direct sentences is really about understanding how the brain works. And the cleanest example of that is if I said you have a choice of these two sentences you're gonna write about, and the first one is uh, the ball was hit by the boy, and then the second sentence, which means exactly the same thing,
yeah,
the boy hit the ball.
yeah,
Now, if I say to a non-writer which of those is the right way, they might say, "Well, I've heard that a direct sentence is better, but basically they say the same thing." So I'd say they're about equal.
yeah,
And here's what the persuader knows: that your brain is wired to want to hear the person first, the boy. Now I've imagined a boy. Now tell me what the boy is doing. He's hitting a ball. If you
right,
do it the other way, the brain has to work harder. The ball was hit by what? What? Okay, the boy. Now I have to play it in reverse because now I know who started it, and then I can replay it. So it's twice as much work to process the ball was hit by the boy compared to the boy hit the ball. Once you learn all of those simple little wiring truths about a brain, you learn things like we only remember 10% of what we experience. I could go on, but and if you make a long sentence, people are just going to get bored and tired, and they're going to wonder why it was so long. So I just don't.
yeah,
Uh, and also, people don't process adjectives and adverbs. So if you were going to write something, let's say in a business context, and you wrote, "It was very hot yesterday." Well, when you write it, you say to yourself, "I need to say very hot because I want them to know, like, it's not just 80 degrees; it's very hot." But what the persuader and a good writer knows is that that person's not going to remember the word "very."
right,
They'll remember it was hot.
right.
So you can just get rid of all the words that people aren't going to remember after they've read it,
Yeah.
and then it becomes clean and simple.
Yeah, and as a reader, you can tell when you hit a passage that hasn't been well done because your eyes start to skip over the words a little bit, and then you start thinking about something else, and you're like, oh, why did I just read a paragraph? I don't even know what I read. The best advice I ever got was just strong nouns, strong verbs, and if you can just remember that, it sounds so simple, but yet people screw it up all the time. Everywhere you go, there's so much trash writing out there that you would think that nobody had ever heard the simple principle ever in their whole life. Why is it so hard to write so simply, Scott?
Well, I think if you take a writing class in college, they teach you to write complicated
Yeah.
because there's some sense that it has to be sort of academic and a certain vocabulary, et cetera. But the genius of writing is to write it so everybody knows what the words mean.
Yeah.
But you and I are professional writers of a certain age. I would say that my vocabulary, if you were to compare it to let's say just the average public, probably in the top 1%, just because I do this for a living. Words are what I do, and still I could be reading something on CNN website, not so much CNN, but just some article, and I'll run into a word I don't know, and I think that's not my fault.
Yeah.
It's
Right.
not my fault.
Right. Right.
So somebody's at fault, and it's not me.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. The bigger the vocabulary you have, you realize the less useful it becomes at times because you can't really drop those words in there. One of the things that your influence on me has one of the th- you have influenced me tremendously. I'm going to use strong nouns, strong verbs, and one of them was systems before goals, and another one. All of them sort of just fit around a mindset. And then the final one was really about thinking of mental models of the world. And I can't remember. I think you might have been the one to introduce me to this, just that phrase, mental model of the world, mental model of the world, mental model of the world being broken. And I had sort of taken that to heart that my perceptive tools, the ideas I was given, the frame of reference I had, none of that seemed to be producing anything that made any sense to me anymore. Like I'm having trouble or has having trouble making sense of the world. Do you think our mental models that we've had up until now are kind of broken? Do they need updating? Does our operating software need updating?
Well, I have said in the last few years that our whole understanding of reality is going to change. And I think politics have changed that because we understand that facts don't matter anymore. We just keep seeing one example after another where somebody can just make up facts and it didn't really change anything. And so I think that's the biggest understanding is that we're all living in some kind of a subjective world. Now, on top of that, you're seeing a big movement toward psychedelics. So people using mushrooms and microdosing LSD and that sort of thing. And I think that that's further emphasizing that reality is subjective. Because if you do mushrooms, for example, I'm not recommending it. I'm just telling you what it feels like. It feels like you've entered a whole different world, but yet it works. You still can take a drink of water. You could still, you know where the bathroom is. Everything works, but it's like you're seeing it for the first time.
Yeah.
Once you have that experience, even once, you realize that the other experience is an interpretation and not an infinitely accurate view of the world.
And where are you getting evidence that people are more interested in psychedelics than they were before? I mean, my first thought was like 60s and the electric Kool-Aid acid test. That seemed like a real phenomenon. Is that really, is this just like among your friends out there on the West Coast? Out here in DC, I don't hear anybody talking about that really.
Yeah, in Silicon Valley, probably everybody beyond a certain level of success has done some kind of psychedelics, and it probably does them on a regular basis. It's as common as drinking, probably, and
Wow.
so it might be different here. But what I was talking about actually was the medical therapeutic uses,
Sure.
because there are people who are experiencing breaking, alcohol and opioid addictions after one dose.
Oh,
Of
like low dose of like psilocybin or of LSD or something?
Yeah, and several of those psychedelics have the same therapeutic value, apparently. So you're seeing, the laws are loosening up in some places. You're seeing more talk of legalizing, more talk of testing, more studies coming out. I would say in 5 years, here's my prediction. In 5 years,
Mhm.
the most common treatment for alcoholism and addiction will be a psychedelic in 5 years.
That's interesting. I have a lot of personal experience with psychedelics. I've experimented with mushrooms and MDMA, especially back in the 90s for sure. And I will say, without any doubt, my experience with MDMA or ecstasy or Molly or whatever the kids are calling it these days completely transformed my ideas of reality and enhanced my senses of empathy, made me feel connected to other people in a way that I hadn't ordinarily. And interestingly enough, it was those experiences that really solidified me to think I was on the left, to think that I was liberal and loved everybody and became much more accepting of everyone, and of just a variety of experiences. Of course, we're hanging out with people from the fringes at that time of society, so it was sort of like a twilight space of culture. Like the right before sunset and that weird glow, and it was just I would highly recommend it, but I don't really recommend it. I can't recommend you do drugs on this podcast, but it was hugely influential on me. And I know it was influential on you, and even in your persuasion book list, where I think there were references to people that, like, maybe it was Timothy Leary on there. I don't know. It was just sort of the experience of opening your mind using drugs to alternate realities. Would you prescribe? No, you're not going to prescribe. Do you think that those types of experiences are essential to understanding just sort of the environment that we live in and just the experience that we're having in this universe?
Well, almost everybody who goes through these experiences says the same thing, which is, okay, I'm forever different.
Yeah.
That's not like having a drink. You know, you can get pretty drunk and you're the same person after you're sober, but you do
Or slightly
hallucinogen.
worse.
You do a hallucinogen once, and your whole worldview will change, and it won't go back. So that's the big difference.
Yeah, that's interesting. I doubt that our nation, or maybe, will ever have widely accepted this notion that everybody needs to take a trip in order to come together.
Yeah, and let me just for the purpose of safety,
Yes.
there's nothing I've mentioned that I think is a good idea without medical supervision.
Yeah.
Because if you have some underlying mental issues or you're on other kinds of drugs, it's some dangerous stuff.
Yeah.
So don't do this lightly. But I think the medical world will embrace this within 5 years.
Um, we've done a little bit over an hour here, and I have a few more questions, and one of them is, um, I appreciate you coming on the podcast. My question to you is why did you, and not me in particular, but why are you so accessible to people who are looking to interview you, alternate media like this? What is it about? How does that fit into your game plan, Scott?
Well, of course, I always have a book out that I'm promoting. So the latest is Loser Think. And I decided that after seeing lots of regular media hits, and then I'll watch, what happens to the book sales. And then you go on James Altucher, and
Right.
then,
Right.
it explodes.
Yeah.
And he's just one example. But podcasts are the new most legitimate way for an author to get known, because those 2 minute hits on CNN or Fox News don't tell you anything. They just put your face out there.
Yeah, interesting. Well, I can appreciate that, but it's also just for me personally. I've been doing other people's podcasts now because I find I just need practice at talking, and I just like enjoy actually talking to people. I always leave these conversations feeling more energetic than beforehand. I got to say, Scott, I was a little nervous before this one. That's not good persuasion, but I was a little nervous, and I used one of your tricks to calm me down a little bit. But I was very excited at this opportunity to sit down with you because truly, for my world changed dramatically 2015 onwards after I got onto Twitter. I mean, my friend Mike and I have been friends since 5 years before he even got on Twitter. Like I was in Mike's wedding. Like I've known him way before any of this stuff happened. So I followed him onto Twitter, and I didn't know what the hell I was getting into or what was going to happen to my life. But like my life is completely, totally 100% different than it was then. Completely new professional career, completely new social life, completely new perspective on the world. And you were definitely a part of that, and your books have been a part of that. And I just want to say thank you, first of all, for putting some great ideas into my head and for sort of leading the way in this new medium, and being like a real sort of torchbearer for this new system of communication, which is still, even though it feels like it's been around for a little bit, it's still like totally in its infancy. This new way of us communicating is just brand new, and in a historical sense, it's all just began immediately right now. We don't even know where it's going to go or what it's going to do, and you're effectively a pioneer. So it's been fun to watch, and I really appreciate that. On this journey for you, what has been the highlight of becoming a social media star, and what was the low? And if you knew then what you know now, would you have still done it?
The answer is yes. I would still do it. I would say the low points are any day that there's some scurrilous rumor about me, and the paid trolls come in by the thousands and make my life miserable for a while.
Yeah.
And mostly it's just inconvenient. I don't like taking all the time to block them all, and so it's just taking my time. But for some reason, most of the professional trolls have left me alone for the last month, and I don't know why. But they all just disappeared, which also tells you they're organized. They are organized. If anybody's listening to this who doesn't know, both sides, left and right, have organized troll armies. You don't always know who's controlling them, but you know when they arrive, because
Yeah.
they all say the same thing and they arrive at the same time. So those are all bad days. The best day by far, and I think Twitter had a lot to do with it, was getting invited to the Oval Office to chat with the president, just because he was working his supporters basically, and that was by far, I think, will be my coolest life experience.
Yeah.
Just going there, being in the Oval Office, talking to the president of the United States about whatever we wanted to talk about for about half an hour. I'm never going to be able to match that as an experience.
Yeah. Wow. Half an hour, man. That's pretty good. It wasn't just a handshake in the line or whatever. That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, congratulations on that. Congratulations on your success. The latest book is Loser Think. What what were the last couple? Was Win Bigly was one before that, right? And the one
Right.
that was How to Fail at Almost Everything
How to fail at almost everything and still win big.
and Still Win Big. All of which have a certain self-help element to them. And I wonder, Scott, the inside of you, there's somebody that wants to help people, isn't that right?
Yeah, primarily. I often describe the perfect life arc as being born as a baby and you're perfectly selfish because you can't do anything for yourself anyway. Then you get a little older, maybe you can help out around the house. By the time you're an adult and a parent, you're probably doing more for your kids and your job and your spouse than you are for yourself. And by the time you die, if you've done everything right, your last moment, as the life is extinguished from your body, you literally give up everything you've accumulated. You just give it all up. So your last moment of life, and as you transition, is the ultimate unselfish act. You give away everything,
Yeah.
and ideally you've left good ideas and influence and advice. So I thought, well, I'm an author. Why don't I put this in a book and I will boost my signal? And I thought I had things to say, but you don't really know until the book's out there and people respond to it. And after I wrote How to Fail, I mean, it was just wildly successful. And people still talk to me every day. People say, I lost 80 pounds. I got off of drugs. I got a job. I got a promotion based on stuff from the book. So that kind of encourages you to do more because, monetarily, it doesn't make that much difference to me these days. But having that influence and seeing people's lives improve, I mean, that's a really big payback. I mean, that is deeply, deeply satisfying.
It really is, and you should be commended for that. And I wish the people that gave you so much hassle online would realize that deep inside, not even deep inside, very much on the surface, is somebody that is really just trying to help people out and is trying to spread good information, useful things that's going to lead to direct improvements in people's lives. And I can say I'm one of those people. And I can say that some of those concepts I have also now leveraged up into influencing other people myself. And so there's an exponential effect to it. So thank you for that. Thank you for coming on the show. I really appreciate it. Thanks for being a good sport and answering some of the questions. Honestly, I really appreciate that too, Scott. And just keep on doing what you're doing, and I'll keep watching. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Jack. Thanks for having me, and good luck with everything.
All right, thanks a lot. I appreciate it.